have been working on this book project called Dance Interventions, looking at transnational politics and contemporary dance. And the presentation I'm wanting to give today is partly related to that. I'm also trying to pick up maybe on Gabriele Klein's discussion this morning, where she was looking at translation, and the last part of her presentation was looking at the politics of translation. Because I'm very much interested in the politics that frame the kind of work that we were also seeing in the opening of the Congress, Faustin Nikula's work, La Création du Monde, and collaborations between Germany, the African continent, funding that enables productions to come here, but also creates networks and choreographic centers in other parts of the world. And the framing, I believe, that explains partly the reason why we're seeing this kind of cross-cultural work in festivals today has to do with looking into the histories of colonialism, but also capitalism and neoliberalism, which is very much the climate that we are finding ourselves in today. And my question to dance is this idea of intervention. What can dance do politically in a climate of capitalism, the crisis of capitalism, globalization? And so this idea of collaboration and studio work, the choreographic process, which is also something that Gabriele Klein was looking at with Pina Bausch, and I think Pina Bausch is maybe a good example sort of thinking of her legacy and how she was maybe the first person to sort of talk to dancers, ask dancers about their stories and their knowledge that they were bringing to the choreographic process, which was a model that then also was taken up by Anne-Theresa de Kersmacher and Parts in Brussels, which is a school that has had an influence, I think, also globally in terms of dancers, choreographers, going through that training or doing a workshop and taking this idea of opening up the creative process globally that enables the kind of work, as I say, that we're seeing today. So the talk is about politics, and in the beginning, in the first part of the talk, I would just like to give you a little bit of a theoretical framing through which we can think about networks, collaboration, and the biggie, capitalism. So 2 years into the announced end of history, Fukuyama, that's sort of the idea that 1989 history ended, suggested that the final victory of capitalism, and the work that we're seeing, I think, in terms of genealogies or dance history, I think since 1989 to the present moment, we are in a new phase of that history. Because post-1989, with the collapse of the Berlin Wall, what we could say is that it reconfigured cross-cultural relations when local performers and their worldwide audiences found themselves in the position of global nomads, no longer separated by the Iron Curtain. Presumably liberated economies grew closer together as the one global market we have come to know by now. Cultural collaborations between Germany and Africa abound, with examples such as Christoph Schlingensief, Monika Gintersdorfer, Stefanie Thiersch, Rimini Protocol, and others. This is just a few. And also quite interesting, the shift in Goethe Institute, if we think about originally it was about language, and more so it has tagged on to performing arts, film, dance, and theater work in terms of how German culture is translated or brought to other countries, and also sort of back in terms of that funding policy and how it has probably changed over time. So these examples abound. On the one hand, sort of supported by funding bodies such as also the British Council, Goethe Institute, also independent institutions. And at the same time, a dancer choreographer such as Faustin Nikula or Gregor Makoma have traveled widely on the international festival circuit between Avignon Festival, South Bank Center, or Yerba Buena Center for the Arts in San Francisco, California. The politics involved in funding such collaborative work, either through the Goethe Institute, British Council, or the independent networks such as African Contemporary Arts Consortium or MAPP Productions in the US, appear to speak of a post-colonial impetus to build bridges of transnational solidarity, which, however, do not fully transcend an imperialist pattern whereby money and funding is shifted across continents to further artistic development on the African continent and elsewhere. Historically, Africa, and this is sort of the example of African contemporary dance that I'd like to focus in for most of the part of this presentation, but I also have a brief look at Akram Khan and Zedilabi Sharkawi's work towards the end. Historically, when we look at the African continent, we could argue that it has been a European transnational project from the very beginning, when the Congo Conference in Berlin sort of divided the country in terms of economic interests by the European powers who were sort of assembled around the table, and then according to their share in the land sort of divided Africa. We know about those sort of artificial borders that were created in Europe, but very much already with a policy of enabling free trade zones before globalization and free trade was sort of invented. So that history goes a long way back and has created a geopolitical situation, the consequences of which we can still see today. Because if we look at this sort of axis that's traveled between London, Berlin, Paris, Brussels, Kinshasa, Abidjan, then those cities are also the cities that the dancers that I'm looking at are traveling today in terms of presenting their work to different audiences. And the examples I'm looking at in the presentation are Faustin Nikula from Democratic Republic of Congo, Frank Edmund Yao, who's been working with Monika Gintersdorf and Knut Larsen from Ivory Coast, and Gregory Makoma from South Africa. Colonialist, I think partly the reason that this funding, the funding enables the touring of this kind of work, may partly be motivated by something we could call colonialist guilt, which plays out in international arts funding to allow for a counter experience that emerges in the face of human suffering and trauma. So I think partly the reason that we find the British Council and Goethe Institute invested in funding this project is probably reinventing their own nations through a transnational outlook of funding bodies and sort of coming to terms with their own guilt about the trauma and suffering in order to enable art in other contexts. And that's obviously well meant, and I'm not against it, but it's also probably problematic. In terms of international touring circuit and transnational networks, it's interesting to consider the following observation by Kenneth Foster, Executive Director of Yerba Buena Center for the Arts in San Francisco, talking about Faustin Nikula's work in the context of the US. And he says, I quote, "Given the current condition of our own world here in the United States, the idea of the piece has a resonance for us that we dare not but must admit. For us too, what is there but more future?" And more future was a work that Faustin Nikula toured quite extensively. It was in Berlin. It's also been touring the US and was asking about the future of the Congo, but I think also the future of world politics in a wider sense. And then the quote continues, and that's Faustin's, "Extraordinarily gifted performance creates a context within which we too can confront that question about more future. With this performance, Yerba Buena Center for the Arts continues its ongoing association with the African Contemporary Arts Consortium, in which we work with our colleagues throughout the United States to present the work of contemporary African artists. Faustin's work is emblematic of the type of extraordinary creative performance emerging from the African continent today. We are proud to be part of this effort and that we are able to present this amazing art from Africa to our community," unquote. What I find interesting in this quote is this idea that he suggests there's a creative artist, he does something quite innovative that probably we don't see in contemporary arts in the US or in Europe. And it's innovative because it says something about the Congo, but it also says something about us. And I think that's the point there, really, that what we see reflected in the work by these artists is a sort of a distorted mirror image of our own politics, which is about Western globalization, the impact of colonialism and modernity, sort of mirrored back to us in a counter-image, a counter-experience that ultimately demonstrates that the continents are interrelated. We cannot really think of Europe or European contemporary dance independently of what is going on the African continent or in the US or other parts of the world. So the beginning of the 21st century then, the moment that we find ourselves at now, is the victory of the capitalist logic, and colonialism is very, or was and is very much part of that. The reason that colonies existed in the first place were part of the capitalist project to exploit resources, and the wealth in Europe was pretty much built on that exploitation. So that logic, in the moment that we find ourselves in now, is sort of victorious, but as post-colonial critique has sort of analyzed, what that means is that at the moment of capitalist crisis, we find ourselves in a state that's characterized as necropolitics. And the quotation I have up here is from Achille Mbembe's work on the post-colony and describes what necropolitics is. So I'm just going to read it out and then maybe also say a little bit more about that, because I think it's quite important, because the argument there is that capitalism creates a state of death and war. And as we see, there are conflicts increasingly in the world, all over in different places. And on the African continent is probably where we see the consequences of capitalist politics most drastically. But I think it's also something that we may witness more widely in the future, if, you know, in terms of if we don't come up with a different politics to the kind of politics that are governing our lives at the very moment. The connection to dance is that if capitalism is a system that slowly but surely creates war and does away with lives in terms of lives being killed, or it could also mean lives becoming redundant in the marketplace because there aren't enough jobs for everybody. This whole thing about redundancies is something that is a nihilism that is trying to do away with life. And dance, and that's obviously what I want to relate to in my talk, I think dance anchors an experience of life, of living, of survival, that is very much at the heart of what the moving body is and what it tries to express in different ways. So capitalism, I mean, to come back to this quote, capitalism has seemingly emerged from its colonial past stronger than ever before. But as against capitalist triumphalism, it is the brutalized condition of a permanent state of war, the image that Mbembe presents of the contemporary African continent, that may well provide the most apt heuristic for understanding the world as we inhabit it now. So that's the definition of necropolitics, against which I would like to suggest, if that is one system that we find ourselves opposed to, then dance, or the kind of life that dance envisions, could be a counter-position, a counter-experience to that, suggesting that in dance we're trying to contest that objectification of human subjectivity that is taking place in the capitalist logic. So I'm going to say a little bit more about Achille Mbembe's theory of necropolitics and then move into my dance examples for the analysis. Achille Mbembe's analysis of capitalism and necropolitics appears appropriate when we look at the work of Hassan Nikula and the Congo crisis, as well as Gregory Makoma's work in the context of post-apartheid politics in South Africa. Following Hannah Arendt's prognostic analysis of 20th century totalitarianism, Arendt aligned imperialism's deadly politics of power and economic expansion with capitalist growth during the last third of the 19th century. It is hence the history of capitalism which partly installed a fascist colonialist machinery of death at the heart of the colonialist enterprise. Slavery, colonization, and apartheid were thus the three foundational experiences of violence and trauma inflicted upon the African continent. They mark the historical claim on suffering in response to which African identity discourse has been articulated from the point of view of victimization by overpowering colonialist forces. Mbembe explains how this discourse parallels to some extent those debates surrounding the impact of the Holocaust, although there is as of yet no comparable collective memory for the psychological wounds of slavery and apartheid. I quote from Mbembe, "Indeed, the Holocaust, slavery, and apartheid all represent forms of originary suffering. They are all characterized by an expropriation of the self by unnameable forces. In each case, the forces assume various forms. But in all, the central sequence is the same. To the orgiastic intoxication summoned by the administration of mass murder corresponds, like an echo, the placing of life between two chasms, so that the subject no longer knows if he or she is dead or alive, unquote. As far as Member's theory conceives it, African identity politics are largely built on the notion of perpetual suffering, which leads towards a passive conception of a self that faces alienation and dispossession, bordering upon a form of nihilism that questions existence at the core. Members' oppositional strategies are suggested to counter such cults of victimization by inserting a different notion of time and self-stylization as already occur in everyday performative practices. Such out-of-time self-stylization, I would like to suggest, is what we also find in contemporary dance forms, as they articulate our human potential for meaningful life-asserting creation against the deathly objectification under the global capitalist regime. Collaborations in contemporary dance thus assert that one is precisely not a slave to the global machine of production, but a political being voicing discontent. If you look at dancing discontent, then European dance theatre since the 1980s partakes in a more widely shared shift of contemporary theatre to redress the trauma and pathos of totalitarian fascism and colonialism. Arguably, the international touring of Pina Bausch's dance theatre and the Flemish wave spearheaded by Anna-Theresa de Keersmaeker articulated a feminist politics of counter-memory to work through the traumatic legacies of a post-war generation coming to terms with their own history. This legacy is taken up in the work by Faustine Kula, Gregor Makoma, but also Akram Khan and Sidi Labi Shakawi, which are both choreographers with a second-generation migratory background. In the age of globalization, new subjectivities thus emerge from this colonialist legacy, with identities being inscribed by diverse histories of corporeal engagement and cross-cultural migration. Modes of collaboration in contemporary dance thus present a phenomenological response to the earlier pathos experiences of global modernity by creating new epistemologies of creativity and autonomy as a deterritorialized space for performative thinking and therapy. The blending of contemporary dance aesthetics with work in classical Kathak, South African or Congolese dance forms and rhythms thus allows for an altered experience of time and space as layers of kinesthetic memory to intervene in the discourse of modernity by dismantling its capitalist fallacy as a bluff. And I now come to my example. So the idea is that dance or the dance intervention consists in the collaborative process that is taking place in the studio, and where forms of what what Joseph Roach originally has theorized as kinesthetic memory, layers of memory that come through traditional dance forms or classical dance forms, which connect the dancing body to different layers of time and memory. And those are being sort of a psychophysical process of how our body knows maybe something about experiences that our own life that transcend our own limited life experience. That through certain body techniques, like meditation or yoga or martial arts, you tap into life energies that are beyond your sort of everyday autobiographical self, if that makes sense. I'm sure that people who do like yoga and these forms may have had those experiences potentially, but they are very different from the kind of way that we conceptualize time as progression in that kind of evolutionary Western colonialist mind frame. And so I think that through that collaborative process, new subjectivities emerge in the studio work that then also translate into the choreographic work that these performers construct. So more future, which perhaps some of you have seen. In that piece, Faustin posed the question how one may survive in a climate where politics are determined by musicians, prey to, sorry, this was one too quickly, asking the question about Nombolo and the music that goes along with it, which is very successful in in Congo and has these sort of huge concerts. They are funded by two competing beer breweries, Bralima, and the other one is Bra Congo, and that makes generates a lot of money for those musicians and artists, and also a lot of respect. And what the work More Future picked up on was this sort of observation that what the Congolese are doing, they go to these parties, they drink, they dance away the frustration that they have over their politics instead of investing in politics. Also, the money that is turned around in these sort of mass concerts is not invested in infrastructure and institution or arts in the Congo, but rather into the pockets of these musicians, who a lot of them live in the diaspora, good lives, but it's not really regenerating the country. So that was the question that Fausto imposed in the work, asking our heroes, our musicians, singers, politicians have lost their credibility for a long time. And thinking about how choreography of sound and music and energy could create an atmosphere that people could still survive in. And as I said, picking up on the music, Flam Kapaya, the musical director for the piece, was originally also part of Vera Son's touring ensemble, and this is the other guy in Nombolo Mpiana, and where we can see the beer breweries. This is just recently 2013 celebration of 19 years of what's it called? Sorry, Bralima beer brewery. Selling beers to these musicians and the kind of advertising that goes on, which in a way objectifies and appropriates a music and dance tradition that on its own is celebrating life and dance, but it's appropriated in this concert context for advertising, for marketing purposes. So it's becoming part of the market, so that, and I'm just going to go back to the image from the choreography. The restaging of partly the music, but also partly the movement of Nombolo, is trying to return to that originary creativity of the dance form, but reframing it in the theater context. And the other musical tradition that he set against that was punk, because punk rock in the 70s was sort of protesting the system. So the bringing together of the two music traditions, as well as using the vocabulary of Nombolo, is reasserting the original meaning of the dance, but also criticizing what is happening to the dance in the country at the moment when it is being appropriated by beer breweries and marketing agencies and generating the money. So in a way, I think with that production, you could see the intertwining of capitalism trying to objectify and market music and dance traditions, as we also see a lot in sort of YouTube videos and music videos where those dance traditions are sort of displayed on a mass media global level, but ultimately objectified, as opposed to what the dancers are doing as a performative stylization of subjectivity that would be Members' argument, where they're trying to create alternatives and a living tradition and a living form of response to life in the Congo today. Because I'm just gonna, go forward. No. Because this is sort of the argument about dance as a performative practice of everyday life, where Member suggests that Congolese dance is never simply movement of the human form. Congolese dance embodies something that resembles a search of original life, of perpetual genesis, and through this for an ideal of happiness and serenity, unquote. So it seems to me that Fausto Nkula and Julius Kabako attempt to recuperate precisely this affirmative energy of the dance form to claim a future for the country in the way that they make it part of More Future as part of their choreography, which was about the history of the Congo and the position of the dancers in an atmosphere where the musicians control politics. Politics is effectively not happening. Where can these politics take place? Maybe through the body trying to survive in that climate, presenting in front of global audiences so that we also start to think about those politics as with our mobile phones, we each carry a little piece of Congo in our pocket because the coltan that's produced in Congo goes into mobile phones. So there's a lot of sort of intertwining that happen that is part of our reality that we are not always aware of, and we may also not even aware of as we're watching this theater piece. But I think the kind of challenge that this work poses is that as an audience we get ourselves informed about the politics and the underlying situations in the countries that those artists are coming from. And so because I want to allow for questions and discussions, so the other examples that are part of my project and that I'm also looking at is Frank Mondial's collaboration with Günther Stoffer-Claassen in the Logo B series, where the Logo B, not unlike Nombolo actually from the Congo, was also a dance form that emerged in response to, and also Coupé décalé, which is slightly different but affiliated in terms of what the dance as a street dance was trying to achieve. Is a mimicry in Homi Bhabha's sense, that it is ambivalent in the appropriation of Western capitalist insignias of power, such as, gold watches, brand name clothes, fancy cars, smoking cigars. This particular video, they are in Paris on the Champs-Élysées and imitating capitalist values and claiming themselves as national heroes in a sort of mock persiflage that caricatures values of Western capitalism, but at the same time, in that appropriation also, whilst it questions, it also internalizes some of those values that go along with neoliberalism and globalization today. So the Logo B was a fast motion dance, almost violent in nature, at once an imitation of fighting and display of clothing and labels. The first time I saw it, I noticed for youths facing each other and going through the motions of a fist fight in perfect timing to the music. One would throw a punch, another duck, another block, all in coordination, unquote. And that's from Sasha Newell's recent book, where he has looked at Logo B in Abidjan, but also the Nushi or gangster culture that was sort of emerging around that. A dance mostly by young men, internalizing those sort of fierce competitive ideological assumptions of capitalism and expressing that through a form of street dance that was symbolizing that to some extent, but also parodying what capitalism is, because people would throw money on stage and there isn't actually any substance to the kind of work that is being performed, which is also the abstraction that we see in late capitalism, that the values, that there aren't any substance values to the kind of money and financial jeopardizing that is going on in the current climate. So that in that context, in Ivory Coast, the Logo B was also sort of picking up on developments of globalization in a dance form, in an energy that was part of what the dance was. I'm just going to go back to the images from Logo B, because what Günther Stoffer's strategy was that she brought Frank Mondial together with different European, very renowned choreographers such as Jochen Roller here and Richard Segal and also Laurent Chetouan, questioning what is contemporary dance, what is the capital in contemporary dance, what happens when I put contemporary choreographers together with Frank Mondial and that dialogue, which was very much about, I think in an interview I've had with Monika Gintersdorfer, she said for her it was also partly wanting to create visibility for Frank Mondial's work, so that there was a market for his kind of dance, as there is a market for contemporary dance in Europe. And that's also partly the intervention, I suppose, in that instance then, is to look at those dance forms and how they become symbolic capital, but also with Monika Gintersdorfer-Klassen's work, throwing up all these political questions, if we look at their work more holistically, and the other kind of work that they have been doing around that series. And To come to the other example that's probably opening up the discussion, as some of you may have seen this work. The situation for Akram Khan and Sedilabi Shako is certainly very different compared to Faustin Ninikula and Gregory Makoma as well. And yet, these choreographers have met each other in festivals. They have worked together. Akram Khan has also, in his early career, done a workshop at Parts in Brussels, where he first met these people. So they are part of that generation, which is our generation, that because of globalization, we have artists with migratory backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, different dance traditions they tap into, so that Akram Khan, born in London, Bangladeshi background, learns Kathak, which is the northern Indian classical dance forms, and starts experimenting after learning Kathak for 10 years, going to Northern Contemporary School of Dance, starting experimenting with that form through Western choreographic models and ideas for choreography. And then in collaboration with Sedilabi Shako, who was sort of coming out of the Flemish context, they create work, and I chose 0 degrees because that was also partly about the border between Bangladesh and India. And this particular photograph, the two are negotiating across that border, and while Khan teaches Shakawi part of his Kathak vocabulary in the piece, Shakawi has always this thing with the hands. I mean, if you've seen his work, it's quite expressive, which also reverberates to some extent with Murasan Indian dance. They're trying to figure out how can we relate our stories through dance and finding a shared vocabulary, negotiating that in the room, and that was very much part of that choreography, which then translated also into Gregory Makoma's work, Beautiful Me, which was a solo piece. But in that solo piece, there are 2 microphones on stage where he dialogues with Faustin Ninikula and Akram Khan, thinking about workshops he had done with the 2 of them, and how learning Kathak vocabulary, which came into this choreography, reshapes his idea of what contemporary dance is, coming from a background where he has learned sort of what's Afro-fusion, different African traditional, African dance forms, let's call them that for the moment, to create a subjectivity in dance, which I think ultimately tries to do away with this sort of identity politics discourses that try to claim a specific vocabulary to a specific national, traditional, ethnic background, suggesting because of the history of colonialism, because of the history of globalization, we are operating in this shared space, which is facilitated by funding bodies, which, yes, mostly come from the West, so in that sense, nothing has changed. But at the same time, the process itself changes because it allows for subjectivities to emerge in dance that are trying to present something different. So Beautiful Me, for instance, he does sort of Kathak, African, then he starts talking about politics in the Congo and how that compares to his situation in Johannesburg, and bringing all of that together in the theater space, where audiences, I believe, then are also becoming part of that oftentimes uncomfortable space where we need to negotiate with the performers what it is that we're looking at, trying to understand. And I think it's probably something that happened here with La Création du Monde as well, is that this kind of works as an audience very challenging for us to get our heads around what it is that we're seeing. And yet I think that is the task of where those politics lie. That's of course sort of what we need to take on board, that the world politics are complex. They are very much framed by victorious capitalism, framing the situation that we find ourselves under to operate. And if, as artists and audience, as citizens, we want to find strategies to defy life and creativity and freedom in that climate, then it has to be collaborative, it has to go through these routes, and it has to use funding, I think, and in strategic and clever ways. And I think that these performances are a good example of that. And I stop here and take questions.
Yeah, thank you, Sabine. I just would like to shortly get back, because I don't know if I got it right, because you said in the context of Thorstein Jekula's work, there was, I guess, a critic, a critic who said that it's sort of about, oh no, it was Membe, it's about the search of originality of life, or of the original life, so that there's sort of a strive to get, and I didn't get that so well, to get back to something, because what does that mean if we try to search an original life? So
that's the quote.
Right. So is there some context around it? Because it sounds, if I read it like this, quite a bit essential. And
Yeah, no, thank you for, I need to probably clarify. This is an essay he didn't write specifically on Faustin's work, but on Nombolo, as the part of the vocabulary that Moment of Future was very much using the music and movement vocabulary from that particular dance, which, similar to Logobi, is a street dance form, is a concert dance with these sort of mass concerts, etc. And it was also in La Création du Monde, when the guy is doing the pelvis rotation, is part, in abstraction. As I say, I think what Faustin is doing, he puts it through a contemporary choreographic lens. So he already does something with the movement to present it on stage. But the sources of that, I think, are clearly also Flamme Capaya was doing part of the musical score for La Création du Monde. So the popular music and dance scene in Congo today is what this essay is talking about. And where Membe theorizes that the popular dance forms in Congo, but I think it's also probably true for other African contexts, always pick up on the energies and the social situations that people find themselves in the present moment. And that's something that African dance forms have always done. I think in that sense, sort of as a living tradition, there's a continuum there, which is then, if we think about original life, it is an articulation of the life force, the energy that makes your body move in certain ways. And they are culturally informed, hence we have different dances when we look across the world and different cultural traditions. But it is an expression of the life force, what keeps you alive. And that also sort of creates a subjectivity that is not victimized, because that's his theory. Remember, so suggests the way that world politics play out, African identities have been put into this victimized position. And he says, actually, to get out of that as a way forward in terms of claiming a future, you have to look into these everyday practices, because that's where the agency and the subject position is and emerges from. And then the example I showed of the guys with the beer bottle in the hand, what happens is, and also in music videos, oftentimes there's creative potential, which is tied to original life and creativity, and the place that dance emerges from in the first place gets appropriated by a capitalist logic, which tries to objectify that form, objectifies the bodies. And sometimes that happens in theater too, because as we are in this beautiful proscenium arch, you are trying to represent, and your body by the gaze could become objectified. But as you're sort of dancing, you can also work with that. And I think Faustin's work is very much about framing and manipulating the frame in the gaze and trying to put something against that, to assert that dance as a technique of survival, of creating what he always says from ruins. If your subject position is in a place where you feel it's worthless, the political problems are such that I can't do anything, then dance and the improvisation and creating from nothing is a very powerful strategy. And that's also something that you find in sort of contemporary choreographic processes, is sort of you start with the material that you have and you bring, and that's quite a powerful statement to make. So I don't know if that answers your question partly, but I think life is essentializing maybe to the extent that there is an energy that we share as human beings, but we share that with the natural environment. We share that with the world, and it's a very different idea to an essentialist, individualist, Western subject that needs to appropriate and objectify, if that makes sense. So it's a bit like a new way of thinking subjectivity that's potentially post-anthropocentric. So it's much more in line with a more ecological perspective, perhaps, where we think about sustainability and the future of the planet in terms of coming to terms with political situations. Because as I said, if capitalism is creating a state of war and ever more conflicts and ever more violence, then maybe the way that we relate to each other in dance would be a counter-politics to that, as we share our differences in a more balanced, equal way.